والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين وبعد. اللهم لا توفيق إلا ما وفقت، اللهم وفقنا اللهم وفقنا اللهم وفقنا، ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم، ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم، ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. Firstly, to start off, to speak about someone such as Malcolm X, rahimahullah, Malik Shabazz, is something which I feel worried about to a degree. The reason being is because he was such a great person and such a great individual and such a great personality that I don't think I could ever give him his rights and his dues in regards to what I will say. And he's a person who his life can literally be studied and many lessons can be taken from the beginning of his life all the way up until his death. And when you study his life and you look into his life and you compare his life to the life of some of the early Muslims and some of the great Muslim personalities that lived in the middle period of our historical timeline, the early Muslims, as I mentioned, some of the late Muslims, you'll find that there are a lot of similarities. And perhaps if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us the tawfiq, we will mention some of them whilst we go through his life. But to start off with, the reason that we all refer to him as Malcolm X is, as everyone knows, he mentioned that he chose the name X to refer to the lack of his understanding of his lineage. Even though his name was Malik Shabazz, he continued to refer to himself as Malcolm X even after he had accepted Islam, as a statement to the fact that he had been cut off from his lineage and cut off from his history. And there is something which is very important to understand in regards to a person being cut off from his lineage. And that is that when a person knows that he comes from a lineage of great people, he will aspire to be a great person. When a person finds out, for example, that he comes from a lineage of kings, he would aspire to what? To be a king. When a person finds out that he comes from a lineage of scholars, he would aspire to be a scholar. If a person finds out that he comes from the lineage of warriors, he would aspire to be a warrior. And this is something that perhaps you will find mentioned in studies, and by reading history, you'll find that individuals inherit certain attributes and qualities from their forefathers. And the fact that we, as an ummah, have been cut off from our history, I think is something which has been done purposefully. As it's not only the black community that were cut off from their history, it's also the Muslim community at large that has been cut off from their history. And to test this, ask yourself simply, can I name 3 or 4 individuals from the last 100 to 200 years who were great, who came from the place where I come from? And we mentioned when we were speaking as a community of our history in the Seerah lesson, that if a person reads about the history of India as a Muslim, it is his history. If he reads about the history of Africa as a Muslim, it is his history. If he reads about the history of the Middle East as a Muslim, it is his history. Why? Because the Muslim's history is based upon his faith, his iman. It is not based upon the color of his skin, nor is it based upon the land which he comes from. And so when we speak about Malcolm X, we're speaking about a part of our history. We're speaking about a hero from our heroes. We're speaking about a person who changed his society, who came from us and we come from him. We're speaking about our brother and our leader, the martyr, inshallah, bi'idhnillah. And so we can take direct inspiration from him as we would take inspiration from our own brother. A person can look at Malcolm X and say to himself, I can do exactly what this man did. Especially the facts coming in from this century. We will find a lot of similarities when we look at his life. And so when we study history, as previously mentioned, we study it to take practical lessons. We study it so that we can understand certain principles that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ingrains into His creation. And we study it so that we can better ourselves and base ourselves upon those whom we study. As Ibn al-Athir, rahimahullah, he mentioned that the person of intellectual capacity, the person who is smart, he will read history and he will use it as a measuring stick to judge his own self. As he'll look to the great personalities and he'll compare himself to those people. He'll look to the personalities that went astray and he'll compare himself to those people. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala opens up his book, the Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, after having mentioned the three types of people, the believers, those who have the anger of Allah and those who have gone astray. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then goes on to mention the believers, the hypocrites and the non-Muslims, and mentions the attributes of these people, and then goes on to mention the people of Israel, talking about the Bani Israel, the tribes of Israel, going on to mention their attributes. Why? So that we can compare ourselves to these people and ask ourselves, barakallahu feekum, are we like these people or are we the opposite to these people? So I want to bear this in mind whilst we talk about Al-Shaheed Malcolm X rahimahullah ta'ala. Inshallah we'll briefly go through a quick biography of his life and then mention some practical lessons inshallah and perhaps a few things on the way. As I said previously, to give him his right, it would need lessons upon lessons, lectures upon lectures, and someone of great experience. And what I would recommend for everyone is to go and pick up his autobiography, Malcolm X, co-written by Alex Haley. Purchase it, read it on PDF, and benefit from his inspirational story. So he was born in the year 1925 to Earl Little and Louis Helen Norton Little. And Earl, he was a minister, a religious leader, and he was also someone who was influenced by Marcus Garvey, who was a caller for black rights at that time and an activist, and as was his mother. They were both influenced and they were both inspired by Marcus Garvey. And so already you can start to see that Malcolm X was exposed to those that were calling for freedom, those that were calling for inspiration, those that were giving inspiration. And we can already learn a lesson here, which is the impact of the parents on their child. Even if we don't raise them to become leaders directly, we will indirectly have an influence over them with that which we mention to them, that which we expose them to. And so we should think about what are we exposing our children to in our households? How are we influencing our children in our households? What effects do our actions have upon our children in our households? And there's a famous story, which I forgot the name of the individual, but someone said to him, you have the handwriting of the scholars of hadith. And upon hearing this, it impacted him. He later on became one of the biggest imams of his time in hadith. And so just a small statement can have an impact on a child. At the age of 6 years old, his father was murdered, brutally murdered. There are some who mention that he was beaten and tied to a train track so that a train could run him over. And imagine, 6 years old, this has taken place. At the age of 13 years old, his mother had a mental breakdown. And his mother was a very strong woman. When you read his autobiography, you'll come to find that his mother was an extremely strong woman. This is a person who was already living under extreme stress due to this situation of America at the time, the racism. Their house was repeatedly attacked by the Ku Klux Klan. They moved from state to state quite often. Their house was burnt down by the Ku Klux Klan. They lived with elements of poverty whilst his father was alive. And upon the death of his father, imagine now a black woman living in a racist country where a black man finds it difficult to go out and make a living. So what about a black woman? And in those times, even white women, they were limited in regards to the ways in which they could make money. And so she was raising, I think 8, including Malcolm. He had 7 siblings, so 8 children, raising them, and had to provide for them. She started to rent out her shed in her garden, and her sons would go out hunting game, bringing back game and selling. And later you'll see that Malcolm X, he went on to get involved in crime and so on and so forth. And the question arises, can you blame him? Can you blame this individual for getting into a life of crime? And in fact, when he speaks about someone that he came into contact with whilst a criminal, his name was West Indian Archie, a famous hustler in his time and someone who gave him some nurturing. He said that perhaps this person would have been a mathematical genius were the circumstances to have been different. And so sometimes we may see those that are involved in crime and we might judge these individuals, but the circumstance sometimes dictates the actions of individuals, and so we should not be so hasty to judge. There's a famous saying in Arabic, al-mar'u ibn asrihi, that a person is the son of his time. If you were to, for example, and you can apply this rule to every single individual throughout history. For example, if you look at some of the great ulama, and you may look at some of their theoretical belief, their theological beliefs, and you'll say this person, he seems to have made mistakes in his theological understanding of Islam. But if you look at the circumstance in which he was living, and you apply this rule, al-mar'u ibn asrihi, a person is the son of his time, then you'll come to realize that perhaps he was influenced by that which was around him. And so you cannot be so quick to judge. So going back, his mother had a mental breakdown at the age of, whilst he was 13 years old. And so he was taken to a foster home. He went to numerous foster homes. And he was a very smart young man, excelled in school, in his junior high school, which would be, I believe, equivalent to primary school here. And he was in fact very popular, and he was given position of leadership from a young age. He was elected to be the class president. And an interaction with his teacher had a profound impact on his life. And in fact, it changed the course of his life, you could say. We don't know, as we don't know what would have happened, but we could say that it could have changed the course of that he took in his life. He said to his teacher that he wanted to become a lawyer, and I'm sure everyone has heard this story, it's very famous. He said to his teacher, I would like to become a lawyer. And his teacher said to him, that is not a realistic goal for a black person. Why don't you try getting into carpentry? And so upon hearing that, he quit school. This was a very smart person. He excelled academically. He was given a position of leadership by his peers, so he was popular. And his teacher put him off education for the rest of his life, for the rest of his childhood at least. And this goes back to the influence that we have on our young children, our siblings, upon those that we perhaps teach, those we come into contact with every day. And we can mention a direct example in a masjid, for example. A child may misbehave, and someone turns around to them and start shouting at them and tell them, get out of the masjid, have respect in the masjid, and so on and so forth. What type of environment are we creating for the children in the masajid? A person may be a teacher, and he may say something to the child, but he doesn't pay any attention to the words that he says, but those words enter into the heart of the child. And a child's heart is very soft. At home, for example, when we become stressed, we may say to our children, stop this, you, so on and so forth, and put the child down. And sometimes you can see in adults that lack of confidence sometimes goes back to the way they were treated as children. And this is something that we need to take into contemplation and consider when we are dealing with the youngers. And not only the youngers, those around us. As the believing mu'min, the believing Muslim, he tries to put confidence into the hearts of his brothers. The Prophet ﷺ, he built around him leaders. And to build leaders, you have to give confidence. So he dropped out and he moved, and he dropped out, he had worked a few jobs. And when he reached his late teens, he moved to Boston with his sister, and his sister would have a great impact upon him, influencing him and taking him in. And later on in his life, she also played a role, as we'll come to see inshallah. He then moved to Harlem, and in Harlem, he was exposed to the criminal scene, and he became a hustler, a gangster. He was drug dealing, pimping, racketeering, running gambling houses, burglaries, you name it, and he was doing it. This is a man by his early 20s, he had become one of the most well-known gangsters in Harlem. And he was run out of Harlem. he had to move back to Boston. He was run out by some of the bigger hustlers in that state, in that area. So he went back to Boston, and he was arrested for burglary and sentenced for 8 to 10 years. And this was a changing period in his life. He entered into prison, and whilst in prison, he was referred to as Satan. The reason being is that he was so anti-religious. And again, we can't be quick to judge. You have to look at the circumstance. This is a man who saw individuals wearing crosses around their necks, burning his house down, murdered his father, racist towards his kind. And he was being told to worship a white lord. But yet, the white people he had been exposed to had been very evil people, and had treated him in a very evil manner. And so a person could judge him for being anti-religious, but we have to look at the circumstance that he was living in. And we also have to look at ourselves. When we present Islam, how are we presenting Islam? What are we presenting in Islam? Sometimes we may have good intentions, but we push others away with our harshness, with our inability to articulate Islam in the best of ways. So he met a person in prison, John Bembury, and this person had a major influence on Malcolm X. He was the one who introduced him to reading, and he mentions him in the autobiography. He says about him that he had never seen a person who demanded so much respect just through his words. And so this had a profound impact on Malcolm X's life. He got him into reading, into education, and Malcolm X basically became an encyclopedia himself. He memorized a dictionary, he read, he said nearly every book he could possibly get his hands on. He would spend the entire day reading and the entire night reading. He read in philosophy, he read in genealogy, he read encyclopedias. He even came up with arguments to prove that the first man was a black man, an academic argument, regardless of whether that's the case or not. And this is a person who dropped out of high school. A person, he said that when I tried to write a letter to my relatives, my vocabulary, it wouldn't go past 200 to 300 words. And I couldn't understand my own handwriting. And he completely changed himself. And if you go online and you look at some of his lectures, some of his debates that he had with professors, he's articulating himself to such a degree that he's basically putting professors to shame. He's shutting down academics. And this is a person who did not go through institutionalized education, a person who educated himself, a person who came from the lowest of the low in regards to social order, social class, and a person who was put off education. But when the spark of education ignited, he went full steam ahead. And this shows the impact of reading. The impact of reading and how reading can change a man. And Malcolm X himself said that people don't realize how much one book can influence a man. Just one book. If a person were to read one book, it can change his life. How many books do we read? And if we're honest with ourselves, perhaps we have some prolific readers here, but most of us, if we read a book every 2 or 3 months, that's something amazing. And we have the ability though to read. You could, if you wanted to, you could finish a book every 3-4 hours. How many of us read? And ask another question. You today, how are you today? Imagine if you were to read for the next year, what would the difference be? How would your language differ? How would your understanding differ? How would your outlook on life differ? The only thing that we need to do is to start reading. And in prison he embraced what he referred to as Islam. So he joined the Nation of Islam. He wrote to Elijah Muhammad, and also one of his brothers. He embraced the nation's version of Islam before him and wrote to him, explaining some of the regulations that Islam, according to the nation, entailed. And he wrote to Elijah Muhammad, as mentioned. He was paroled in 1952, and he went to Chicago to meet Elijah Muhammad. Upon meeting him, Elijah Muhammad gave him a deputy role, deputy minister at one of the temples of the Nation of Islam. And from there, he started to rise and he became the main spokesperson, and you could perhaps say the most influential person within the nation of Islam. But we see that there was a person who was influencing him, there was a person who was giving him that nurture, there was a person who was advising him, and although that person had major problems in himself, he still benefited. In prison, the same thing. He had someone who was influencing him, someone who was advising him, someone who was teaching him, and it shows the importance of teachers, the importance of role models, having someone that we refer back to, someone that we can seek advice from. And of course we should make sure that that person who we're seeking advice from is a person of wisdom, a wise person, a person who knows what he's talking about, not any person that we see to suffice. No, we have to make sure that this person is a person who truly has understanding. So he became the head of, or the deputy of a minister of one of the temples, and he was credited with opening up other temples, multiple temples. He was appointed as the head minister in Harlem, the city which he once fled from, and he was credited with expanding the nation, and the different numbers that are mentioned. Some mention 10,000 up to 40,000 individuals that joined the nation through Malcolm X, and this is in the period of maybe 5 to 6 years. And this is something that we have to ask ourselves now. The nation of Islam, what is it that they were presenting? They were presenting a form of Islam, and it had major problems with it. The key being racism, and ascribing a prophet to Islam after the coming of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, the final prophet, as mentioned in the Quran, amongst other issues. But yet Malcolm X was so passionate, he had so much energy, and he was so willing to sacrifice his time and his money to spread the message that he had taken from Elijah Muhammad, and we see the result. So why is it that we're not producing results? Why is it that our community, we're not producing results? Why is it that we are stuck in a situation where we're not speaking out, we're not bringing people to Islam in these numbers? And this is one man, and perhaps he had people around him who were helping him, but he was the one that was doing a lot of the work. And if we look at the message of Islam, it's very simple and it is very beautiful. But are we out there presenting it? Are we sacrificing our time to present it? Are we raising the banner of Islam up high so that others can follow, the way that Malcolm raised the banner of the nation? And as I mentioned, Malcolm X, he was a man from our century. So what he achieved is achievable. It's just about studying and understanding and emulating, trying to copy that which he did, trying to aspire to reach the heights that he aspired with our message of Islam, which is more than possible. Whilst in the nation of Islam, he was again credited with influencing the famous boxer, formerly known as Cassius Clay, who became Muhammad Ali, rahimahullah ta'ala, who in of himself was a leader. And there's an interview you can find online which shows the amazing personality of Malcolm X and shows the extent of this man's leadership and humility. He was asked, is it true that you've influenced Muhammad Ali and you're his spiritual advisor and so on? And he said on live TV to the interviewer, he said to him, no, that's not true at all. I express what I know and understand, and he has a mind of his own, and he makes up his own mind. He comes to his own decisions. And so look at the respect that Malcolm X gave to Muhammad Ali. Instead of saying, and he could have easily done so, as he was the head spokesperson of the nation of Islam at the time, he didn't say, yes, he is my student and protege, and I raised this man, and but due to our hard work, he has become the most successful boxer of his time, and so on and so forth. No, he said that he is responsible for his own decisions. He has a mind of his own. And so this shows true leadership. True leadership is to build other leaders. True leadership is to build those around you. True leadership is not to build followers. And the Prophet ﷺ, he was a person who built leaders. He was a person who left behind leaders. And it's said many times It's been said many times before, at the death of the Prophet ﷺ, that is when Islam spread its wings left and right. At the time of the Prophet ﷺ, Islam was strong in Medina and in Mecca and other parts of the Arabian Peninsula. But upon the death of the Prophet ﷺ, it reached the Far East and the Far West. And so we can see that a leader leaves behind leaders. And this is true in Malcolm X. And I said in the beginning, you'll find similarities between Malcolm X and some of the early Muslims and the great Muslims that lived in the middle period of our historical timeline. And I said previously as well, when you read the life story of one reviver of Islam, it's as if you read the story of all of them, because they have similar qualities, they have similar characteristics in one way or another. One of the characteristics of Malcolm X, which stands out in all of the stages in his life, is his ikhlas, his sincerity. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, "Inna sidqa yahdi ila al-birr," that truthfulness, sincerity, guides a person to the right path, to righteousness. And this is a man who was truly sincere, without a doubt. How can we come to this belief? Because of the fact that remember, this is a man who was propagating the message of Elijah Muhammad. He was propagating the message of the nation of Islam. He was openly calling to it, he was staunch in his calling to it, but yet he publicly went back on everything that he had called to before, when he was a part of the nation and then left the nation. He publicly went against that which he was calling to. He openly became a critic of the nation of Islam. He openly declared the problems of what he used to follow. So he didn't care about his own personal following. He didn't care about what he would look like in the public eye. He cared about following the truth and standing up for the truth. And so this is ikhlas. This is the result of ikhlas. It's extremely difficult to have an opinion in the public sphere and then go against your opinion later on. It's very difficult. So under the nation, he influenced Muhammad Ali, rahimahullah ta'ala. Muhammad Ali joined the nation of Islam, and later he would leave the nation of Islam. And he said, at the death of Malcolm X, he later said that one of the biggest regrets I have in my life is turning my back on Malcolm X. Because when Malcolm X left the nation of Islam, Muhammad Ali, he became a spokesperson for the nation of Islam. And because he was a part of the nation of Islam, he turned his back on Malcolm X. In 1964, Malcolm X left the nation of Islam, and in this year was a crucial point in his life again. He performed Hajj in this year, in 1964. And the person who provided the funding for his Hajj was his sister, who took him in Boston. So he went on Hajj, and the lessons that you can take from his time in Hajj deserve lectures in of themselves. He mentioned some amazing things, and he wrote a letter to his wife Betty. We'll mention a few things in regards to her later, inshallah. He mentioned that I found something in Mecca. I'm paraphrasing, not word for word. I found in Mecca, I'm praying next to a white man with blue eyes. I'm praying next to a black man. There's no difference between us. And he also mentioned that the white people here, they're not like the white people in America. Because when they say they're white, they don't say they're white with an authority to it. It's just the color of the skin. It has no other meaning. And this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us, that the best of you in the sight of Allah are the most pious of you. The skin has nothing to do with it. And when you take this into contemplation whilst looking at history, it goes back to what I said, that the history of Africa is our history. Even if you come from India, African history is your history. Indian history is a white European Muslim's history. Wherever you find the history of a Muslim, it's a part of our history as an ummah. And we can take lessons from it, and we should be proud of these individuals, regardless of their color, regardless of where they come from, regardless of their culture and ethnicity. So after the nation of Islam, he went on Hajj in the year 1964. He also founded some of his own institutions, and he traveled to Africa, visiting some of the leaders in Africa, from them the president of Egypt, of Nigeria, and other countries. And he also participated in a debate in Oxford Union. And this is something which is amazing as well. And in 1964, there was still major racism going on in the UK. UK was not a place as accepting as people like to try and portray. Yani, 40, 50 years ago, perhaps, if you were to walk into a shop before many of us were born, you would see no blacks, no dogs, and no Irish. And this is something that we have to ask ourselves when people are having this argument and discussion about British values. Yani, which British values are we talking about? Because 50 years ago, British values would mean not allowing Irish and black people into shops. And he was invited to Oxford Union to give a talk. Oxford being one of the best universities in the world, one of the most prestigious places in the world. And for you to give a talk in Oxford, this is something which was at that time reserved only for the elite. And this is a black man who's speaking against white people, has a history of speaking against white people, speaking against what the British colonial system stood for in of itself. And the British colonial system was a system of racism, and it was built upon the backs of black people and coloured people. But yet he went to Oxford Union and spoke and articulated what he was calling to, and propagated what he was calling to in front of these people, and they stood up and clapped for him, gave him an applaud. And this in of itself is something amazing. This is something which shows that this was a man whose status was raised by Allah and Allah alone. When those who you're speaking against invite you to speak in front of them, this is only from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And also there's a hadith which should come to mind. من ترك شيئا لله عوضه الله خيرا منه. Whoever leaves off something for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give him something better than what he had. Malcolm X left off a life of, perhaps he was famous as a criminal. He was famous amongst the circles of criminals. But he left off all of that, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala raised his rank. He left off the nation of Islam. He left the nation of Islam, in which he became very prominent and famous, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala raised his rank. And so when we leave off something that we're perhaps attached to, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give us something which is better. If not in the dunya, then in the akhirah. And also if we look to the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, when Yusuf was put in prison, and he came out of prison, he was given the position of a minister in the Egyptian government. He could go wherever he pleased within Egypt, and Egypt at the time was one of the most powerful places on earth. So the narrowness of the prison cell was swapped with the vastness of the dunya for Yusuf alayhi salam. And the same can be said about Malcolm X. The narrowness of the dunya, of the prison cell, was swapped for him with the vastness of the dunya. He travelled around Africa. When he went on Hajj, he was made an esteemed guest of the prince at the time, Prince Faisal, who then went on to become king of that country. He went to meet the presidents of African nations. From them, Gamal Abdel Nasser. Gamal Abdel Nasser at the time, with his views and what he pulled to aside, was one of the most powerful leaders of the Arab and African world at the time. And this is Malcolm X, someone who dropped out of high school, sitting in these people's presence and talking to them about the problems of his people in America. This in of itself shows that this is a man of ikhlas, a man whose rank has been raised by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In 1964, after Hajj Africa and so on and so forth, he returned to America, and he had some issues, as we all know, with the nation, and he received death threats. His house was firebombed, his car was attacked, firebombed, and he was later martyred bi-idhnillah, granted shahada by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Manhattan in 1965. He took 21, when they performed an autopsy, they found 21 shots in his body, 21 shots. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala honored him with a martyrdom. He performed Hajj. A year later, he was granted martyrdom, inshallah, bi-idhnillah. And so this is a beautiful ending. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us all a beautiful ending. And tens of thousands of people attended his funeral. Tens of thousands attended his funeral. Those that he spoke out against, such as Martin Luther King, praised him. Even those that were critical of him praised him and spoke highly of him. And he was given acceptance in the earth. And he is still mentioned up until today. So that's a brief summary of his life, and for those that would like to find out more, then I would highly recommend that you pick up the autobiography by Alex Haley and read it. You can read it literally in 2 or 3 days, because when you start, you'll become drawn into it. And there are some recent authors that have tried to ascribe to him certain things which I'm sure he was free of. And they always do this to the heroes of Islam. You will always find that Orientalists try to ascribe certain acts to them, or they try to mention them in a bad light. And to move on, there are some lessons that I wanted to draw from his life, but I think, some quick lessons. We mentioned in the beginning of his life, from the age of 6 years old, we see that he went through a very hard and difficult life. Before the age of 6, his house was attacked, burnt. He saw his father attacked. He would hear his father's name slandered, hear black people slandered, hear the accusations and racism and so on and so forth at the age of 6. The age of 12, we mentioned, or 13. The age of 13, we mentioned that his mother had a breakdown, nervous breakdown. And let's look at the life of the Prophet ﷺ. Before his birth, his father passed away. At the age of 6, his mother passed away. At the age of 8, his grandfather passed away. And so we see similarities. And the beginning of his life was a life full of hardships. I'm not comparing him to the Prophet, saying he's a prophet, don't get worried. What I'm saying is that a life full of hardship, and hardships develop men. Hardship produces men, and produces people that make change. And so we might see today our ummah is going through hardships. We see that our ummah is going through problems. But we should also see that this is a we should also see that, it just reminded me of a hadith. The Ahnaf, they mentioned that the laughing breaks the wudu, isn't it? And so people, they say that this is weak and they have no evidence. They have an evidence. The evidence is that the Prophet ﷺ was praying with some of the companions, and one of the companions entered and there was a hole, and he fell into the hole whilst they were praying. So they started laughing. And so the Prophet ﷺ told them afterwards, whoever laughed, he needs to perform wudu. So they derive their rulings from this. So the hardship produces men. Perhaps we could give an example. When you're trying to produce a juice, the harder the squeeze, the better the juice. The darker the night, the brighter the stars. And so the hardships that we're going through today are only so that the men of our ummah can shine tomorrow. The question we need to ask is, will we be from those men? We don't need to worry about the state of Islam. We need to worry about, will we be from those that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chooses to establish Iman. The second lesson, stand for something great. Malcolm X, we saw what he stood for. He stood and he sacrificed right until the end. And he stood for something. From the moment that he went into prison until he came out of prison and was granted martyrdom, inshallah, he stood for something. What did he stand for before he left the nation of Islam? For falsehood. But yet he was so passionate about what he stood for that he was willing to sacrifice everything. And this could perhaps lead to talking about his wife, Betty X, as she referred to herself. This was a strong woman as well. We may see Malcolm X as a strong man, but behind him was a strong woman. This is a woman whose husband was out most of the time, traveling, calling. He was a man who lived in a state of extreme poverty. When he passed away, when he was granted martyrdom, inshallah, he didn't even have a house anymore, as his house was fired by the nation. He left behind his wife and children with no wealth, no money. His car was given to him by the nation of Islam as a means for him to travel around. But yet, we don't hear about her publicly talking about Malcolm X. We don't hear about her publicly criticizing him. She was a woman who was patient. Perhaps she didn't like it sometimes, but she was patient. She was a pillar of support for her husband. And this led to her husband giving himself fully to that which he believed in. And the same can be said about the wives of the Prophet ﷺ. Khadija radiallahu ta'ala, she was a pillar of support for the Prophet ﷺ. when the Prophet ﷺ came and mentioned to Khadija what he had seen in the cave, and he was worried, Khadija was his pillar of support. She said, don't ever worry, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will never leave you to be alone or to go astray, or لا يخزيك الله أبدا, never disgrace you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will never disgrace you. And she started to mention the characteristics and the quality traits of the Prophet ﷺ to give him confidence in himself. She married the Prophet ﷺ, and she was more wealthy than the Prophet ﷺ. As she wasn't shallow-minded, she didn't marry the Prophet ﷺ because of wealth. And this shows the great role that a woman plays. And especially today, we sometimes overlook the role of a woman in the house, raising the children and supporting the man and encouraging the man to be a person who produces change in his society. We can also see that Malcolm was very aware of the vices and oppressions of his time, and he saw things for what they were. If you listen to some of his speeches, for example, he'll talk about the television, he'll talk about the media, he'll talk about that which is going on around him. And it is very important that we're aware of our times, we're aware of the vices around us, we're aware of the traps that have been placed to catch us and our children. And it's very important that we raise awareness about these things. And we also provide alternatives to these things. The nation, they had a newspaper that they would produce and they would distribute. And this is a form of media. And at the time, newspapers were the biggest form of media, you could say perhaps. And so today, what alternatives are we providing? What alternatives are we using to get our message across? And it was previously mentioned that every person has a role to play. Perhaps someone will be qualified in media and can provide alternative media. And this is something which is needed. Having long-term visions and strategies. As we can see, and perhaps due to the shortness of the time, you can't grasp the fact that Malcolm X was a visionary and a person who had a long-term plan. He was willing to take his argument to the United Nations. He went to Africa to try and gather support for the African American people, as referred to. For the black people of America, he tried to gain support and create a network. A visionary, a person of long-term vision. And they say that a person of long-term vision thinks ahead and will think about the big things. A person of short-term vision, a small-minded person, will pick on the small things. And so we should ask ourselves, what do we pick on? What do we notice? Are we always quarreling and quabbling about the small things in the masjid or the small things in our community? Or are we looking ahead and thinking about the bigger picture? Education, importance of education. And this in of itself is what raised Malcolm's level, raised his status. And we can see, as mentioned previously, the Prophet ﷺ, the first verse that came down was, read in the name of your Lord. اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق. Read in the name of your Lord. The Prophet ﷺ, he would, in one of the battles, when they had to bury the companions together, he would ask which of them has memorized more of the Quran, and he would put this person first. We mentioned the hadith previously in some of our discussions that the Prophet ﷺ said, whoever seeks knowledge with the intention of reviving Islam, if death comes to this person whilst he's on this path, his level, his station will be one below the station of the Prophets in paradise. And it's that long-term vision and seeking knowledge, seeking to educate ourselves, establishing Islam, reviving Islam, and seeking knowledge to do so. And if we look at those who have always been given the leadership positions in our ummah, at times of success, it was the people of knowledge, the people of education. Starting with Abu Bakr radiallahu ta'ala. When the Prophet ﷺ ordered him to take the lead in the prayer, this had a significant meaning. There were those that were specialized in the Quran in the time of Abu Bakr radiallahu. Yet the Prophet ﷺ, and he was a memorizer of the Quran. Ibn Kathir mentions that he had memorized the Quran in his tafsir. But there were those that were known for their knowledge of the Quran, yet Abu Bakr was given precedence. Why? Due to his understanding, due to his knowledge. And there's a very important lesson here, which is that we should involve the people of understanding, the people of education, the people of knowledge in our projects. And we should educate ourselves before we endeavor for example, media, we need to educate ourselves in that, but also have education of the Islamic sciences, so that we can avoid falling into the haram and stick to that which is permissible in a broader sense. Strong women, as we mentioned, Beti Shabaz, Beti X, the impact of encouragement and discouragement, as we mentioned, the encounter that he had with his teacher saying to him, this is not a realistic goal for a black person. Imagine if his teacher had said, that's an excellent goal, you should struggle and strive to become a lawyer. Perhaps he would have became a lawyer. And alhamdulillah that he didn't, because he went on to refer to these lawyers and these people that were working for the institution at the time as house negroes. He said that these people, they were people that were eating on a table with a white man, and they weren't concerned with the crumbs that a black man was getting. How many house Muslims do you have today? And are we from those house Muslims? What are we calling for? What are we standing for? These are lessons that we have to take and questions that we have to ask ourselves. And also John Bembry putting time into others. This is a man, imagine, this is a convict, he's come into prison, and this man has seen him, John, has seen this person, this young person, referred to as Satan because he was so anti-religious. He's an ex-drug addict, an ex-pimp, an ex-drug dealer, an ex-gangster, an ex-gambler, but yet he saw something in him and he gave him time, and he took the time to nurture and educate him. How many people do we often overlook? How many people do we give time? Perhaps Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may not use us, but we use those that we educate and spend time with. And if you look at, as been mentioned previously, again, the Prophet ﷺ, Halima, the suppleness of the Prophet ﷺ, the only reason that she took him was because she was shy to go back to her land without a baby to suckle, as all of the other women had taken the other children. And she saw the Prophet ﷺ and overlooked him and said, this boy, he's fatherless, and so there's no wealth in it for me. But she did not know that this would be the Prophet of Allah Subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so she suckled the best of creation. And the same as this man John, he did not know that Malcolm was going to go on to become one of the revolutionaries of his time, one of the people who had perhaps the biggest impact on black society and white society in America in his time. And so we should take into consideration who we nurture, how we nurture, who we give time to. We can also look at the importance of presentation, something that I didn't mention when speaking about Malcolm X, but something which is very relevant to us as Muslims in our community. He was described as being a very handsome man, and handsome, of course, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but he was described as being a person of spotless presentation and a person who paid attention to his looks. And this is something which is very important for us as Muslims. When we present ourselves to non-Muslims, and when we present ourselves to each other, we should present ourselves in the best of ways. If you have gold and you want to sell gold, where do you sell gold? You sell it in the best of cases. If you go to a gold shop now, you find that they buy the lights, they put the glass, they're constantly polishing the glass, they make sure the sign suits the gold that they're selling, and so on and so forth. And Islam, of course, is more valuable than any precious metal. And we are the bearers of Islam. We are the presenters of Islam. And so we should take care of our presentation, as the first thing that a person sees is you before they hear. And so we need to take care of our presentation. And the Prophet ﷺ gave us the guidelines. The Prophet ﷺ, you could smell the perfume that he would wear as he walked past. And this is for the men, of course. Always smiling, the best way to do it is if someone greets you, smile. If you greet someone, smile. It doesn't mean you literally have to walk around with a smile, as that's not natural, and it will probably scare some people. But when a person greets you, try to smile. Wear presentable clothing. When we're speaking to others, we should look the part. And if you look at the nation, this was a part of the reform that they put into their community, that they made sure that everyone that represented the nation of Islam was presentable. And we are representing something which is far greater than the nation of Islam. we're representing Islam, representing the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so we should pay attention to our presentation. Also, there's an incident which took place, referred to as the Hinton Johnson incident. Hinton Johnson was basically an individual that was a part of the Nation of Islam, and he was beaten down by the police, beaten so severely that he had internal bleeding and he had to go to hospital to receive treatment. And the police were keeping him in a cell, keeping him in the police precinct at the time. So Malcolm X, he went down with a lawyer, and they were trying to secure his release so that he could go to prison, so that he could go to the hospital. And they were refusing. At first they were saying that he's not here. They were denying the fact that he was even there. But what happened is roughly 4,000 members of the Nation of Islam turned up outside the prison, the police precinct. And when they saw this, they became worried. So they admitted that this man was present. And Malcolm realized that it was not possible to gain this man's release. So he came to a conclusion with them. He went outside and he gave a hand gesture, and the members of the nation left quietly. And there's a famous statement that's mentioned. One of the police officers said in an interview that one man should not have this much power. And the lesson that should be taken is there is power in the followers. Followers have power. And if we look at the difference between Musa alayhi salam and the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, the difference was in the followers. What did the followers of Musa alayhi salam say to Musa? They said, اذهب أنت وربك فقاتلا إنا هاهنا قاعدون. You and your Lord go and fight, for we are going to stay here and wait. What did the Prophet ﷺ's followers say? They said, if you were to take us into the water of the sea, of the oceans, we would follow you. Don't worry, don't think that we're going to say to you as the followers of Musa said to Musa, سمعنا وأطعنا, we hear and we obey. And so followership is as important as leadership. And followership is something which grants power to a movement, power to a body. The Prophet ﷺ, he mentioned in a hadith, one of the most beloved slaves to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is someone who is not known amongst the people, and he has no concern for being known. If he's told to go to the back, he's in the back. If he's told to go to the front, he's in the front. And knowing our roles and knowing our positions, this is leadership in of itself. Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he was the greatest of leaders that man has ever seen. But yet when he was under Abu Bakr, he never overstepped Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu's authority. Even though he was a person who the Prophet ﷺ would refer to in gathering opinions. In fact, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent verses down showing that Umar radiallahu anhu's opinion was correct, and the opinion of the Prophet ﷺ in certain cases was incorrect. But yet he did not overstep his authority under Abu Bakr radiallahu ta'ala anhu. And this is true leadership. Leadership is to know when and where we should speak and how we should act, knowing a hierarchy if a hierarchy is set in place. As we mentioned, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala raises the rank. We mentioned that a person drop out from high school went from being a petty crook, who if he had continued as a hustler and a gangster, he would have ended up in one of three places: a mental home, a prison cell, or death. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala raised his rank. He was having sittings with some of the most arrogant and biggest leaders of the world at the time, and he was having debates with academics in Oxford Union and other places. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala raised this man's rank. And we said the hadith in the sidq yahdi ila al-birr, that truthfulness, sincerity will take a person to guidance. And this shows that we need to work on our hearts, work on the truthfulness that we have in our hearts with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ask ourselves, am I true with Allah? Because I can present to the people something, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that sees my heart. If I'm lazy and I don't come to the masjid, there is no point in trying to justify it to myself. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what's in the heart, I should say to myself, I'm being lazy. And Allah, you know that I'm being lazy, guide me and give me strength. And work on our hearts. As the Prophet ﷺ mentioned, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in the Quran, a person will not find any benefit on Yawm al-Qiyamah إِلَّا مَنْ أَتَى بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ, except for the person who comes with a pure heart. And a person who has a pure heart, this will guide his limbs to act for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sake. Islam is the solution to racism. Malcolm X, rahimahullah ta'ala, he mentioned in a famous speech that he gave, he was talking about the problem of racism in America, and he said that I see Islam as being the solution to America's problems. Why? As Islam breaks down the boundaries of racism. We just have to look around us today and we'll see this is the case. In this very masjid, you have a white person next to a yellow person, next to a black person, next to whatever other complexion you'd like to describe him as. And this is what Iman gives us. If you go on Hajj, and this is what changed Malcolm X's life. If you go on Hajj, and some of the brothers have been on Hajj, we performed Hajj this year, you look and you find that you're all facing one qibla, you're all wearing one robe, you're all performing the same acts, you're all trying to please the same Lord. And this is what unity is. And this is the beauty of Islam. And so were we to truly submit our hearts to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it will destroy the barriers of racism. And the last is, in his martyrdom, we find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he was truthful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala raised his rank and blessed him with the best of endings. He only lived for around 40 years. But yet he achieved within 10 years what some men would not be able to achieve if they had 2, 3, 4 centuries worth of a life. And Imam An-Nawawi rahimahullah was a similar character, a similar personality. He wrote in every field that he wrote a book which became the pinnacle of that science, and he only lived for about 40 years. And the scholars, they mention that the barakah, the blessing, is not in the length of a person's life, but it is in the achievements of a person's life. And a person who has a close relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you'll find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala places barakah into his work. He is able to achieve in a few years what men cannot achieve in centuries. And I end there, inshaAllah. وصلى اللهم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين.